Hello and welcome to the first session of our Global Supply Chain Institute's Fall 2020 Virtual Forum. Thanks so much to our forum partners. Your engagement supports everything that we do, and we sincerely appreciate it. My name is Mary Long. I'm the Managing Director of our Supply Chain Forum, and I'll start by covering a few housekeeping items, and then I will hand it off to Kate. For Q&A, you can submit questions for our speakers using the Q&A function in the menu on the left-hand side of the web app. Many of you will recognize our Q&A tool, Slido, from our previous in-person forums. You'll be able to upvote questions in the queue, and you can pick the ones you find most interesting. If you have questions for our tech team, please leave a comment in the forum feed, also on the left-hand side, or send an email to the gsci@utk email address. We will post this recording of the session next week, along with a copy of the presentation deck here in our event app. It is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the Supply Chain Forum, a member of the Haslam College of Business faculty in graduate and executive education, and our Vesteds pioneer, Kate Vitasek. I'm going to turn over this session to Kate now, and I'll rejoin you near the end for a Q&A.
Thank you, Mary, for having us. And actually, I'm joined today by Elijah Ray and Amanda Lundell. Elijah, many of you may know Elijah. He's been just such an amazing figure in the supply chain and logistics space, former president of CSCMP, just a wealth of knowledge, a leader driving relational concepts for as long as I've known Elijah. So I'm real excited to see Elijah here representing Sunland Logistics. And then we have Amanda Lundell all the way from Sweden, who is one of our graduates of our Certified Dual Architect program. And she has done 7 vested deals. And so she's definitely an expert in the philosophies that we teach. And so we wanted to do a very interactive panel about how you take this theory of vested and put it into practice. So in our topics for today, we're going to share a little bit about the theory, but really be heavy on the practice. So I'll plan to play the academic role, which I'm good at, right? I'm an academic. So I'll play that role of what's the theory behind vested? Why is this rule, the vested 5 rules, why is the rule important? And then Elijah and Amanda will talk about how real organizations put these theories into practice to drive much better relationships, buyer-supplier relationships. So before I get started, just a little bit about our research. I joined the University of Tennessee in 2003 to lead a large research project funded by the United States Air Force. Most everyone on the forum knows that the university is incredibly well known for our work in supply chain. And so we had a very large research project to study how to make buyer-supplier, especially complex outsourcing type deals, how to make them work better. And that research has led to 6 books on the concept. Our first book was actually launched in 2010, and it was called Vested Outsourcing, 5 Rules That Will Transform Outsourcing. And Elijah, I remember back in the day, and this was about the time, when were you president of CSCMP? What year was that?
It was back in 2003, 2004 time.
Yeah. And then I remember being at a conference and talking about some of this research that we're doing, and people would come up and they'd pat me on the shoulder and say, great idea, it'll never work, right? And so you just walk away and could be deflated. But I'm really excited that since, almost 20 years later, since 2010, lots of companies, actually, we have 86 companies that have done deals. And it's very exciting to see the results that people have. And that's why we want to really highlight the practice of how organizations are doing. So what our research found that it's not about what's in it for me, right? It's not a buyer, supplier getting the best deal. It really is about creating the best relationship to achieve mutual goals. So instead of what's in it for me, the vested philosophy flips that on its head and says, what's in it for we? So you're co-creating, you're developing, you're solutioning an outsourcing agreement and a contract that is going to get you to an outcome, business outcomes. So instead of tasks or transactions, you're going to have a what's in it for we outcome, mutual gains philosophy. So to put this in perspective, I have an analogy that I always like to share. It's kind of like going to Mount Everest. So let's pretend the buyer is the climber and the supplier is the Sherpa, right? The buyer can't get to the top of Mount Everest without the Sherpa. And of course the Sherpa could, but why would they? It's risky. They want the buyer's money, right? They want something out of it. So together they actually can have mutual gains. And so we want to create these deals where the business outcomes that the business is trying to achieve, the buyer and the supplier become partners to achieve those outcomes. And in a traditional contract, what you see is that people outsource for transactions and activities, and they measure those transactions and they pay for those transactions, billable line items, right? One of our case studies is Dell and FedEx, and they had 19 billable line items. Every time they stored a product, that, you know, there was a payment, and every time they ship a product, there's a payment, or repair a computer, there's a payment. And so we get very tactical and activity driven instead of looking at the big picture. So in a vested agreement, the buyer and the supplier really buy the future. They're buying the outcomes that they want. And what that does is it puts the buyer and the supplier on the same side of the rope. Now, I love this little visual of the tug of war at the bottom. Remember when you were probably kids, you played tug of war, and the person with the most power, you know, wins. You know, if they're bigger and they're stronger, they're going to win. And the CIO of Procter & Gamble, when we were doing our research, said, Kate, you know, that's kind of myopic, because in essence, you put the buyer and the supplier on opposite ends and you're tugging. That power, you know, is like you're back and forth, and that creates a lot of friction. And what happens if you put the buyer and the supplier on the same side of the rope and start pulling together? Right now, the power is multiplied because you're on the same side of the rope. So this collaborative, highly transparent, win-win philosophy can help organizations achieve their big, hairy, audacious goals, their Mount Everest, right? And we profile this in one of our articles in Harvard Business Review that just came out in September of this past year. And one of the things that we saw in our research is that really smart people kind of got these. They got what it takes to have a great outsourcing relationship or a buyer-supplier relationship, but it wasn't being manifested into the way people worked, and definitely not into the contracts. So we wrote this book partnering with David Friedlinger, a Swedish attorney who specializes in outsourcing large, complex outsourcing agreements, and Oliver Hart. Oliver Hart is an economist at Harvard University. He is a Nobel Prize winner. So he won a Nobel Prize in 2016 for his work on contract theory. And so what the point is that we say strategic partnership. We say we want to go to Mount Everest, and then we write contracts that are very transactional, very, you know, billable line item. What's the price per whatever? I'm going to give you, I don't trust you, so I have a detailed statement of work. I don't trust you, so I have lots of metrics and I'm micromanaging you. So what we get is what we bought. And that kind of makes sense. You know, my grandma used to say, well, you get what you pay for. And that's true. That's our research, you know, almost a decade of research shows that. Golly gee, sorry, you're not excited about your supplier, but you got what you paid for. Let's turn around and ask a different question. What is it you want, and how do I translate what I want? How do I buy the future? How do I buy these outcomes? How do I create a flexible contract that embraces the dynamic nature of business? Business is dynamic. It snows on Mount Everest. We have to embrace that rather than shift the risk. Golly gee, it snowed. Amanda, sorry, the risk is on your end. So if we're writing these two rigid contracts, if we're shifting risk instead of sharing risk, sharing reward, it creates a lot of perverse incentives and bad behaviors that lead to, in economics terms, known as transaction cost economics. Friction, inefficiencies, a lack of willingness to innovate, think, for example, that simple little termination clause in your contract. You know, we say we have a strategic partner and we have a 60-day termination for convenience, because after all, our lawyers don't trust our supplier, and if we want to get out of it, we can. So that's not a bad thing to have flexibility, but it drives a perverse incentive, because if I'm the CFO of the supplier, why would I make an investment more than 60 days? You're only going to get tiny little improvements because there's no hope of a future return on investment. So in our research, by studying successful deals that had won lots of awards, where the buyer and the supplier were saying, this is an amazingly successful relationship. For example, Procter & Gamble and Jones Lang LaSalle, 2-time winner of Supplier of the Year, only 5 years after signing their outsourcing agreement. How could you go from not having a supplier to being Supplier of the Year out of 80,000 suppliers? How is Microsoft winning all of these awards in outsourcing for their partnership with Accenture? How do these organizations think? What do they do differently besides just saying strategic partner? And that's where we get the 5 rules. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each rule, and then I'm going to turn it over to Elijah and Amanda to show how they put these theories to practice, because that's the secret sauce. You know, Dell, I remember laughing with the chief procurement officer of Dell, and he said, Kate, the rules, there's radical common sense. We just don't do it. And how do we do it? Because it's not the norm. It's not what we normally do. So let's dig into each one of these rules and have a dialogue with Amanda and Elijah so we can take the concepts and the theories and see how they're being put to practice. So let's start with rule number 1, which is outcome-based versus transaction-based business model. So an outcome-based business model, that's kind of like going to Mount Everest. It's a business outcome. You can't get there together. It's something bigger than either one of you. It's the future. Today, you're at the base of Mount Everest. You want to go to the future. And a transaction-based business model is, most simply, think of it as you're paying per unit, per shipment, per mile, per widget, per call. You get the picture. You're buying a task and you're paying for the task. So my analogy here is that if the supplier's a rat and you put that rat on a treadmill and you put a little piece of cheese in front of them and you pay them for every single transaction, they love transactions. If I'm a 3PL, I love storing your stuff. I love warehouses full of stuff because I get paid every time I have a pallet of your stuff in my warehouse. Yet, isn't the goal to actually optimize and not have high customer service, but low inventory? That's the hard problem. That's the wicked problem that we need to solve for. And a transactional model actually creates a perverse incentive. So Amanda and Elijah, let's pick on you. Elijah, let's pick on you first. How do you take this concept of outcomes and have a different discussion with your customers and translate this into how you work?
Very good. And look, first of all, Kate, thanks for this opportunity. It's great to be with everybody. Look, one of the first things that we do systemically in our organization is that we look at our customers from three categories: strategic, emerging, foundational. And for our strategic and emerging customers, we look at them very strategically in a partnering fashion. And so how we look at them is, and we try and encourage from the very onset that we don't even enter into a transactional based pricing model. We sometimes end up there, but our focus is to try and end up in a more open book approach that really helps to facilitate this vested approach. And so that's the first thing, is that we try and stay away from that transactional based model. The other thing is that, and this is very important to the overall approach, is that we teach our people and all of our leaders to focus on getting to the outcomes. We really emphasize voice of the customer. Where does the customer want to go? What's their Mount Everest? what is it that we're both trying to achieve? And primarily from our side is to look to the customer's interest and get there, understand what they are, and then base how we approach them, our savings approach, our lean approach. All of that is focused on helping them get to that, to their outcomes. And that is focused on, and when we start to talk to the governance piece, there are periodic checkpoints. And are we achieving the savings, the outcomes? Are we getting there? Are we achieving the milestones that we set up in the original agreements? So two things, teaching our people that not getting savings for a customer is not normal. And we have that's a practice that we have to do, or we're not successful in our jobs. The other thing is making sure that we're focused on their outcomes and getting that upfront in the relationship.
Good. So Amanda, just how do you do that? How do you get those focus on the outcomes upfront in a relationship? You've done, several vested deals now, many of which are restructuring of existing relationships, kind of like in the HB article, Dell and FedEx, or Island Health with their hospitalists. So restructuring existing deals. But sometimes you've actually helped organizations who are going through a bid process. How do you actually do that? How do you get that then to change away from this transactional activity-based mindset?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I mean, I think a lot of the times when we are brought into the process, as I'm working for EY as a consultant, we tend to be part of the process in terms of helping them sort of being on the buyer side to help them negotiate the best price for their deal. And what we have done this last 5-6 years when we've been working with this new type of model is rather that we help our clients to think about, so what is it that you actually want to achieve with this relationship that you're structuring with your partner or supplier? So taking a step back and just thinking, so what do you want? Do you want transactions or do you want business outcomes? How will the business you're in change over time, and how can we facilitate that your future partner can accommodate that? So what we do to make sure and understand that, because as we talk about a partnership, this is something that needs to go both ways. So what we do is what we call sort of a sourcing business model mapping to understand what are the key drivers within your company that makes you want to go towards more of an outcome-based model, because you want to achieve business outcomes in terms of better employee satisfaction, or you want to have an impact on the environment, more broader perspectives in terms of how you can actually impact your business. And based on this sourcing business model mapping exercise, we can identify which model is the most suitable for that relationship. And depending on the answer to that, and in terms of ending up in a vested agreement and wanting to shift maybe a transaction-based model that you've had with previous supplier to more of a vested partnership, what we do is we can also do sort of an assessment on the contract to understand, so what are the key elements, so to say, that are not working in your current contract. And as you mentioned, Kate, this is sort of the basis of the vested methodology itself. So to be able to shift the transaction-based model to more towards a vested, we look at the key elements that we need to address specifically before moving in to the vested journey, so to say. So that's usually how we do.
Good. And so I heard two things come through from both you and Elijah. One is that Vested's not the only model. It's not the best model. It's one model. And so, Elijah, you said you segment your customers, right? Yep. There's strategic, and then I think there were 3 elements.
Yep. Emerging and foundational, yes.
Emerging and foundational. That's absolutely right. That follows, I think, what Amanda's talking about, sourcing business models. We actually segment in the book Strategic Sourcing in the New Economy. 7 sourcing business models. So Vested is one model. It's an outcome-based model, a formal relational contract with outcome-based economics. But it's absolutely acceptable to say, you know what, this isn't strategic. It's not strategic. And I really just want transactions.
Yeah.
And so you think about third-party logistics, and Intel is actually one of our case studies. They spend, and I think at the time we were working with them, $1 billion in third-party logistics spend.
Wow. Yeah.
So and they have lots and lots of suppliers. Why only one vested deal down in Costa Rica and then a second deal in the Netherlands on reverse logistics? Why aren't all of their suppliers vested? Right. And it's because you can look at something and say, do I have a problem I'm trying to solve? Is there a bigger picture? Or do I just simply, Elijah, I love Sunland Logistics, but you know what? You're just a rat on a treadmill. You're storing my stuff.
Right.
And so buyers segment just like you do. And so what we're looking for is that cross where the buyer needs something strategic. They need a Mount Everest. And you've got a supplier who's the Serpo saying, I want to go to Mount Everest, right? And so it's that merging of the buyer and the supplier where there is a willingness to rethink how they work, which is it's other rules, right? So rule 2 through 5, changing the nature of the work, changing the nature of the metrics and the governance structure. And so I like, Amanda, what you said is before people go down this path and say, well, vested sounds good, you slow them down and you say, what is it you really want out of this?
Yeah.
Is the market, is there a supplier that can actually deliver on your Mount Everest? You've got to have the capabilities. So it's putting that thought in there. And Amanda, you guys do a great trick and you have people actually create a shared vision. And so their top 5 or less desired outcomes. And that in essence becomes their Mount Everest, right? So how does that work in reality, right? So normally you've got the buyer and they're sitting there saying, I want to buy X, but you say you're a neutral. Very interesting, right? So you don't work just for the buyer. You work on behalf of the partnership, helping the buyer and the supplier craft the rules for their partnership. So talk about that shared vision and desired outcomes, how that comes into fruition.
So as sort of standing neutrals in the process and the vested, we have both the buyer and the supplier as clients, and our role is actually to help them find that balance between both of the parties. And what we do is actually we sit together jointly in workshops and develop and brainstorm what is truly the essence of this partnership and what do we want to achieve. So it's not something that a buyer on their side thinking about, okay, so what is important for us? And then the supplier sort of reacts to that. It's more a co-creation process where you develop everything through rule 1 to 5. And I think that is also super important because that is how you create that partnership and the foundation to actually, even before signing the deal, you build that trust and transparency and really have a joint definition of what you want to achieve as partners.
Yeah. And out of that comes what we call a statement of intent. So your shared vision, your top desired outcomes, and guiding principles. The commitment to the behaviors, the commitment to transparency, to equity, to honesty. So there's some guiding principles that would really set the tone for the behaviors. And that's where the relational contract comes from. So rule 1, outcome-based versus transaction. Remember, not every deal you have should be outcome-based. I pick on one of our case studies is Procter & Gamble and JLL, Jones Lang LaSalle, and facilities management. P&G has 80,000 suppliers. They can't all be vested, right? So segment out, and the ones that really, truly are strategic. I like what you said, Amanda. Slow down, really assess, is there real outcomes here? Look at your existing contract. Where are you cheating on the rules? Right? Because if I say I want to do this, what's holding me back? Because maybe you're only cheating on 2 of the rules and you've got some, so you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah. So let's continue with these other rules. So rule 2 is focus on the what, not the how. And for here, I point to a philosophy called Joy's Law. named after Bill Joy. He says, no matter who you are, most of the bright people don't work for you. And so I really love how A.G. Lafley, the CEO of Procter & Gamble, put this philosophy into place when he wrote his book, The Game Changer, to talk about how P&G is so relentless about innovation. He says, for every P&G researcher, there are 200 scientists and engineers elsewhere that are just as good. So just because P&G hires the top 0.5% of college graduates doesn't mean that there's not hundreds and thousands. Actually, he says there's 1.5 million people elsewhere who could bring ideas. So the philosophy is P&G doesn't have to come up with all the great ideas. We want ideas to come through P&G, not from P&G, but through. So we want to harness these strategic suppliers to bring innovation and help us do that. Now, in order to do that, we have to rethink our statement of work. Look at your contracts. And you're sitting here going, oh, Kate, it's too early. You're talking about contracts. So, over a cocktail, a beer, pick up your contract and just start laughing at it, literally, and going, suppliers shall, and how fat is that statement of work? Suppliers shall go into all these details. Well, in essence, what we've done contractually is we put a handcuff on our supplier. We tell them we want innovation. We tell them we're at the base of Mount Everest and want to go to the top. Yet we've written a statement of work that contractually binds them to the transactions at the bottom of the mountain. So Amanda, let's start with you on this one. How do you put this into practice? How do you get companies to kind of learn how to let go of all that detail in their statement of work? Because, they put that in because they don't trust the other guy.
Yeah. No, it's very interesting because depending on what type of company you work with and what type of people that are part of the process, this is definitely different. And I would say I work with energy companies and pharma companies and telecom companies, and depending on this is more or less sort of difficult for them to manage and sort of have the mindset shift of actually not detailing all the specifications on how the supplier should do the work. And I think this is one of the key elements actually of the vested sort of methodology, because it really enables the supplier to be innovative and bring new ideas. And actually, given current circumstances as well with COVID, we've seen that several of the vested contracts that we have supported with are performing better than some of the more transactional and traditional deals. And I think one of the reasons is due to this, because we've seen that it enables the supplier to be more proactive, make suggestions on how to manage this changing environment that we are in, especially within facility management that we've done a couple of deals with, or more than a couple. We truly see the value here and the effects of actually having a flexible framework and enabling both parties to make quick decisions and not having to write change requests just as you change some small detail on the service delivery. So I think this element is really key. And I think people nowadays really realize that as well, because we're receiving much more requests on partnerships and the vested approach as well.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
And you talked about the flexibility, right? So instead of having the detail that says you're contractually obligated to all these little tasks and transactions, exactly the way to do it, you do what we call a workload allocation, right? And a taxonomy. So you're looking at the inventory of all the work, and it's not one way. It's not supplier shall, it's we. Buyer needs to do X, supplier needs to do Y, and together we have the best chance of getting to Mount Everest. And you know what? I like what you said, Amanda. Sometimes it snows on Mount Everest. So therefore, it's not about the change order against the task versus the price. It's about, wow, what are we going to do? It's now snowed. How can we respond to that? So Elijah, what about you? What about this rule 2 and how you guys think about this?
Yeah, so look, what we do relative to, statement of work and getting to the shared vision is after the buyer says, Sunland, it is you, we select you One of the things that we do is we have our name for it. It's called advanced quality planning. But many organizations call it joint planning. But it's basically it's a session where we bring in all of the stakeholders, the key stakeholders from both organizations, and we ask for a commitment. Sometimes it's a 2-day commitment. Sometimes it's a 1-day commitment. It depends on the complexity of the SOW, the statement of work. But we have those stakeholders in a room, and we again start with voice of the customer, expectations, getting to the outcomes, and then after we finish with voice of the customer, expectations, and then we do that both sides, expectations from both sides, outcomes. Then we actually do a SIPOC. It's a Six Sigma tool where we say, SIPOC, supplier, input, process, outcomes, and customer. And so what we do is we take every functional area that the customer has given us for as their processes, and we say, let's talk through each one of these. Who are the suppliers? What are the inputs? What's the process? What are the outcomes? Who are the customers? And so through that dialogue, through that exercise, after we've talked about the shared vision, we start to go through this process and tearing the processes apart, looking at the current state and what the customer has done historically. And now we are, we're not the experts on their processes yet, but we're experts in our field, in our discipline. And so what we do is we identify as we walk through this, here are some opportunities to innovate. Here are some opportunities to make some processes better. And then through that, we prioritize as we walk through KPIs, and we prioritize and say, we might not do this on day one, but over the course of the relationship, 3 years, 5 years, here's how we're going to tackle these things because we think there's opportunity here. So that joint planning exercise where that shared vision and those outcomes that are talked about, the camaraderie, all those things that, the building trust, and, obviously during the acquisition phase, that building trust, the interaction has already occurred. But once you get to that point, you start to elevate that because you've got many parties together working on the shared vision and the outcomes that you're seeking.
Yep. Good. So let's move on to rule number 3, which is clearly defined and measurable desired outcomes. If I'm going to seek for outcomes, then I need to measure outcomes. In the HBR article, we used the example of Dell. Dell had over 100 measures. So they were very transactional service level agreements. And when they came up with their desired outcomes, they had 6 desired outcomes. When they came up with those and they started to look at the existing things they measured, it was kind of like the aha moment, light bulb went off and said, I'm measuring the bottom of Mount Everest. I want to go to the top of Mount Everest. So almost all of the metrics they had weren't helping them get to where they wanted to be because they were measuring today. They were measuring the service level agreements for the transactions, not the business outcomes. So, and to use Yogi Berra, he's always full of wit. He says, you've got to be careful if you don't know where you're going because you might not get there. So Elijah, what do you say? How do you think about rule 3 in practice?
Yeah, so look, I think it is so critical that you don't have this. I think you refer to it in your book as this minutia of metrics, and that you have those 4 or 5, no more, maybe 6 metrics where those metrics, those key performance indicators will get you to the desired outcome. So that process I just described to you, what we do as we look at those core processes, we typically ask, well, what measure, what key performance indicator would apply to this, and what is the operational definition of that metric? And together we make sure that it will get us to that destiny. And if for whatever reason we have to change upstream, then we do that.
Yeah. So Amanda, we teach a tool in our Creating a Vested Agreement class called the Requirements Roadmap to help people do that. Talk about how that Requirements Roadmap works in linking those outcomes to the measurable objectives.
I think that is one of the key sort of elements that ties the ecosystem together, because what we do, usually we use an Excel file just to state the vision, connecting the desired outcomes that we need to perform on to actually reach towards the vision. And then we break the desired outcomes into objectives, which are a bit closer to the business, but still on a very high level. And then through that, we talk about how should we measure the objectives. And then what we define then is actually when will we identify or define that we have a successful partnership or not. Because if we reach the metrics, we will reach the objectives as well as desired outcomes. So it's sort of an ecosystem and a flow of how we ensure that both parties' interests are aligned, and that usually, as we all know, if we're measured on something, that is what we're going to do. So we want to pick the metrics that is actually key performing indicators to connect into the objectives, and not measuring operational stuff that is on a very detailed low level. And I think one of the key elements here that is quite different to a lot of the traditional deals that I've seen is that the metrics are measuring both parties. So it's not that we only measure the supplier in the requirements roadmap. We measure the performance of both parties, and it should be a collaboration, and to be able to achieve the desired outcomes, both parties need to perform. So that is one of the key elements when identifying the metrics. And then we also stipulate exactly who is going to measure them, who's going to follow up on the data, how often will we measure them, to ensure we have all the background of actually being able to take action depending on the outcome of that measure. So it's a very rigid structure of how we actually follow up on this 10 to 15 key performing indicators.
Right. Perfect. So we would teach 5 or less desired outcomes and 12, maximum 15 objectives. And so when you, as Amanda, I like what you were saying, is when you achieve your objectives, you achieve your outcomes. In essence, you've climbed Mount Everest. So that's a different philosophy than measuring the activities today. So most people want to start out and say, when's my supplier going to get to the green scorecard as fast as possible? And when you're really doing outcomes, and it's something bigger, right? It's the future. You're not going to get there in the first quarter after you sign up your 3PL or your facilities provider. Instead, you start out with a red scorecard because you're at the base of Mount Everest. So don't be afraid that your base is red, because you're going to the future. And in Microsoft, actually, they had a 7-year plan. So their plan, if they executed it perfectly, was going to take 7 years. And as you said, Amanda, I like it. It forces people to measure where they're going. And Microsoft actually achieved their desired outcomes within 2 years. Right. And so by going the future, you start people climbing up the mountain instead of being stuck at the bottom. So we have to not only change the work that we're doing, as you and Elijah pointed out, but the measures need to change as well. And I urge you to talk about it's bilateral. It's not it's not the supplier's statement of work and the SLAs for the supplier, but they're bilateral. What do we need to do to climb our Mount Everest? So this takes us to rule 4, a pricing model with incentives to optimize the business. I always like to use the analogy of a steam engine, because if I don't have innovation, I'm not going to get the future, right? So I need to be constantly driving innovation and transformation. So if I just want transactions, it's showing up to do what I'm doing today. But if I want the future, I have to do something different. I have to come up with the next steam engine, or it could be just continuous improvement. And so there's a difference between a price and a pricing model. A price is what you go to Starbucks and pay $3.87 for your grande two-pump vanilla latte. A pricing model is where the buyer and the supplier are modeling the business, and you win together and you lose together. You win together, lose together. So as you climb Mount Everest, value is created, value is shared. So the underlying philosophy behind Vested is a grow the pie, share the pie. But that also means that in a time like COVID and things are restricting, right? Think about facilities management where you don't need the space anymore, right? Oh, everybody's working from home. I'm not spending as much money. I don't need to have catering. So we lose together and we win together. And by being in the same boat, you actually now can look at it. So, oh, it snowed on Mount Everest, right? What are we going to do about this? And we're seeing organizations be incredibly creative in how they're responding to COVID because of their flexible relational contract. So Amanda, let's start with you and then I'll go to Elijah. How's this pricing model? How's this different, price versus pricing model? What are you seeing?
Yeah, this is the one that I think going through the journey, a lot of our clients have a difficulty understanding sort of the difference in the beginning, and that we're actually not defining a price up front, what is going to be the cost for the service delivery and the scope. Rather, we jointly develop sort of a pricing model based on scenarios, based on how do we see that we're going to complete and fulfill the desired outcomes, and actually tying more the performance of the partnership to the pricing model to ensure that we're driving aligned interests and reaching that win-win, lose-lose situation. And there are sort of four key components of the pricing model that we structure based on the Vested methodology. And I think the key aspect of that is that we as partners are not satisfied with just delivering basic services as of today. What we want to bring with this partnership and what we actually defined earlier on is that we want outcomes. We want something that is transforming the service delivery to something that we might not know how it will look in the future. So we need to incentivize the supplier to actually drive the service delivery towards the needs of the business. And as you mentioned, Kate, related to COVID, and we have a few facility management deals, and we've seen successful results from that because they are able to, maybe the cleaning services are being reduced, but then they can do other things and deliver value based on, for example, monitoring and tracking. So they shift the service delivery towards the needs of the business rather than just performing services based on what's in the contract. And that is what they are rewarded with in the end as well. So that is how the mechanisms of the pricing model is driving the aligned interests along the way.
Right. And so let's say you have a third-party logistics deal, right? So you're outsourcing your logistics. In a traditional transaction deal, the supplier would get paid for every unit they store, right? They love storing product. They get paid every time. But what we really want is to optimize our inventory. Well, that inventory is on the buyer's books. So now how do you develop solutions that improve planning and reduce waste, reduce breakage, all kinds of stuff. So there's all these great creative ideas when you start to say it's not about the storage, it's about optimizing our inventory. Storage is one piece of it. So Elijah, what do you think about this? How do you think about pricing and the pricing model and making that switch?
Yeah, look, so, very similar to Amanda, one of the, I want to call it hybrid vested arrangements that we have is because I sent a guy your book, and this really happened. I sent the guy your book with our customer, and he says, I really like this. He said, let's set this up in our relationship, and that's what we did. And so what we have, it's a kind of a fixed variable or a fixed. There's a fixed component. There is an open book, cost plus. People refer to it as cost plus. but I like to refer to it as open book because it's not about the plus, it's about transparency. And there's this open book. So we share, and so we have a budget, and we share in, if we beat the budget, we share in the savings. And so we're incentivized for beating the budget. And then the service component of that is that we have these metrics that are, inventory, shipping accuracy, inbound, dock stock. All those metrics are so important to the service that we set a benchmark. And if you here's the base benchmark. If you achieve something greater than that, then here's an incentive for you. And if you perform lower than that benchmark, then guess what? Some of the management fee that's built into our payment, we lose that. Same way on the open book on the budgeting side. If we do not meet the budget, guess what? We take it on the chin. So it's set up very nicely. There's incentive for both parties to work together to reduce costs and to implement service enhancements. So it's working very, very well.
Good. Yeah. And Elijah, you talked about you called it kind of a hybrid vested deal. We would actually call that, from an economics perspective, a performance-based agreement. So really looking at the, not necessarily the boundary spanning business outcomes, but hey, here's what we can do to perform to a better level to achieve our outputs. Yep. Right. And so tying the performance, pay for performance-based contract. So that is where Amanda talks about shifting up the sourcing continuum. We definitely love people, if they can't make the shift to fully vested, to make the shift to a really good relational contract with performance-based aspects. Right. And that's going to move you up to creating value. And then if you can, then once you build trust and you do that, then shifting up even further to vested. And we teach, and definitely a cost plus environment, we like that better, but we would teach the very best environment would be what we call a cost pass through. So there's no plus, because in a cost plus environment, the supplier has a perverse incentive to have more cost. Right. Now, you've got a counterbalance that said, if I save, I get a bonus. So it's going to counter that. But by having the profit separated from the cost, it's not a cost plus, it's a cost pass through, the cost of the cost of the cost. And now the supplier's profit is directly tied to not only the performance, but the actual business outcomes. So that's going to take us one step further. So, but I like what you say is you can kind of get into these hybrids and then take another step forward, or you can just kind of jump off the cliff, which is, I think, where Amanda's team does, is helping people feel comfortable being able to push that envelope even further. So let's
I just have one additional comment, Kate, and I think this is pretty important, because what we also talk about is total cost of ownership. And I mean, that is, once again, it's both the supplier cost and the buyer cost, and how we can actually expand the pie and optimize the business to not only look at the supplier cost base, but jointly identifying opportunities based on total cost of ownership.
Amanda, I think that is so great, because in this contract agreement that I just referenced, we actually use the words total cost of ownership, TCO. It's actually the language in the contract.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when you actually now start to link the economics to the TCO, not the budget of how much I spend with you, dear supplier, but my total cost of ownership, magic starts to happen. Intel and DHL are one of our case studies. And they start to get out of the four walls of DHL and look at total cost of ownership, inventory optimization, and all of a sudden, there's all kinds of wonderful examples of how they came up with solutions that they were looking very myopically. Buyer was looking at buyer, supplier was looking at supplier. And this gets to our last rule, which is insight versus oversight governance. We move from a me mentality to a we mentality. And the best way I know how to describe this is, instead of managing the supplier, right? We typically would say manage the supplier, supplier relationship management. SRM, and we'd say, no, it's not that. SRM is strategic relationship management. You manage the business with the supplier, not just managing the supplier. So Elijah, talk about Rule 5. How's the governance change?
Yeah, so look, dealing over 30 years and dealing with various companies, some companies have a lackadaisical approach to governance. Some have a very, I'm going to call it strict or legalistic. We like, something in the middle, but in most cases, we actually drive that because we think that a certain amount of the way we look at our relationships is that this system of governance, this system of periodic touch points, we design that on the front. That's one of the things that we talk about in that joint planning process. It's a key element in that process as well. We outline what that looks like for what we think it should look like for both companies based on, how we structure the relationship with tie-ins, top to top, business owners, operations owner. And then we kind of design, we want to have, 3 quarterly reviews, whatever that amount is, we together decide what that looks like, who's going to be involved. And in each one of these, I think the word insight is so critical, but because internally, how we talk about it is that we want to be able to give our customers insight. And that's the big thing that customers, we all are looking for insight. So we feel that we're responsible for giving them that. And so in these key milestones that we establish with our customers, and we find, again, some are open, some are not. And that's why I think it's so important, those who are less interested, that they become educated and understand the failure, the failure potential when you don't do these things. I've seen a lot of failures in our discipline over the years, and those failures typically come because organizations aren't disciplined to this type of mindset. And when organizations are disciplined to this mindset, they're typically greater results. So we believe in this, try and guide if a high profile or any of our strategic customers aren't there, we lead them there. We lead them there and we show them the value. We educate them through what we're doing now, the concepts of Vesteds to lead them there.
Good. So Amanda, what's your take on Rule 5? And we have 6 minutes left, but I want to leave at least a couple of minutes for a wrap up. So what's your take on Rule 5?
So I know that I've said that all rules are important, and this one is also really important because it's truly here is where it all ties together. The 4 rules that we developed, the contract and the content, but this is more the people, how we can work jointly together in a 2-in-a-box, what we call it, philosophy, where we have both the supplier and the buyer, as you mentioned, Kate, finding and optimizing the partnership as sort of business happens. So the mentality of this governance model is to ensure that you give the authority to the lowest possible level within the partnership to actually make changes quickly and collaboratively, and you communicate on a regular basis to ensure that you continue to be aligned and really strive towards the future, and actually ensure that all the elements that we have developed, that we are following up on them, that we're working with the pricing model together, because we know this is a living partnership, and we want to ensure that we have a governance model that accommodates that, both in terms of the governance structure itself, but also the processes that supports us to change and move as long as the partnership is evolving as well.
Yeah. And so there are design principles, just like with all the rules, we teach design principles in relationship management. For example, there's 9 design principles. And the teams co-create their governance structure based on the design principles. So it's really not, one throat to choke. It is really about managing the business with the supplier. You need the supplier to be your SERPA. The SERPA needs the buyer. So it's not us versus them. It really is what's in it for we. So we've had such great success over the past 10 years. Actually, we've had 7 books. One is actually in Swedish, David Friedlinger. But lots of companies, over 400 companies sending almost 3,000 people to our classes to get trained in these, 86 deals, over 100 certified deal architects. Amanda, I know EY has just really embraced the concept. I think EY has about 10 of our over 100, right? And we'll graduate a lot more. We should have about 130 by the end of the year. So this is our last year's numbers. We take score every February, which is our birthday. So Vesteds has a birthday. It's February every year. So we've just been out 10 years. So great progress, great success. I love case studies, success stories. J&J, Amanda, congratulations.
Yeah.
Y'all did the J&J Sodexo deal, won some really big industry awards for their innovation in what they're doing with their suppliers. So fantastic. So I challenge you guys on out there in our little Zoom land live stream feed. What's your Mount Everest? And we have, Mary, I'm going to ask you to come back. We have another session where we get to ask lots of questions. So tee us up on what's next.
All right. Thanks, Kate, Elijah, and Amanda. This was awesome. It was such a great discussion. And yes, we have a lot of questions in Q&A. So I'm going to jump in here really quick and prompt the audience to give us a bit of feedback. These sessions don't come together without us behind the scenes trying to adjust to what you liked and what, maybe you thought were opportunity areas. So this slide here directs you to where you can see on the app to just rate the session and give us some feedback. And we'll collect that and take action appropriately. And you can always email us as well. We know that your time is valuable, so thank you a lot for helping us to get this right. We will post, as a reminder, we're posting the recording of this session next week, along with a copy of the presentation here in the app. Thank you all so much for being a part of our first fall 2020 Virtual Supply Chain Forum mega session. What I wanted to do as well is, Kate, you did a great reminder for me, so thanks. And the session at 1 o'clock today, Eastern Time, is Ask Me Anything. And as you saw all those questions come up in the Q&A section, you can, over lunch, you can update those, upvote them. That session will be something that you can participate live in, and the team here is going to answer those questions for you, and that will be the participative part of this. So, and you'll be able to ask more questions as well. So thanks so much to everyone who participated. Thanks especially to our speakers, Kate, Elijah, Amanda. I really cannot say enough for all the effort you put into this and all our preparation sessions. Behind the scenes, Hannah Kirby, thank you so much. Michelle, Cole Burns. It takes a whole team to pull all this together, and I really appreciate everything. And I will end with thank you so much to all our forum partners. Your engagement is just tremendous, and we love it. So join us.
Yes, join us for the Ask the Expert. We're going to stick around, and you can have all those questions. We will, no slides. I promise, no slides. 100% Q&A. Dig it to us, and we will just back and forth have a really rich dialogue. So we'll look forward to having you join us in the Ask Me Anything.
Definitely.
Great.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.